Well, hello everybody. Welcome to the second birthday video of the CB&Q in Wyoming version 5. I'm Mark Pruitt. The layout's been under construction for 2 years now, which means two things. First, this layout has lasted longer than the previous layout in New Jersey, and second, time is really flying by. So to avoid wasting any more time, let's get right into this past year's activities on the layout. We'll start with a brief recap of year 1 of the layout from June 25th, 2020 to June 25th, 2021. On June 25th, 2020, construction of the new layout began by bringing together all the L-girder benchwork that supports Casper Yard. Remember, I brought Casper Yard with me from version 4 of the layout in New Jersey in 3 sections. By June 25th of 2021, Casper Yard was mostly functional and ballasting of the yard was about half finished. The Chicago and Northwestern line above Casper, which would have been very difficult to construct once Casper was moved back against the wall, was complete and mostly scenic all the way around the far corner. This is where we'll pick up for this past year. Didn't I say the recap for year 1 would be brief? We hit the first birthday in the middle of ballasting the yard, and I carried right on with that. By early July, the classification yard throat ballasting was finished. I didn't even glue any turnout points into place. Then I stopped ballasting for a while. I installed the last tracks in Casper, the second turntable lead, and the commodities delivery track for the engine facility. Then came painting of the track in the west end of the yard. Late in July, I did some work on the Casper skyboard, repairing seams and refreshing the paint. At the end of the month, I began applying a thin layer of plaster over the west end of Casper. Here I was working on the grounds of the Standard Oil refinery around the loading tracks. The next step, in early August, was to apply dirt to the newly plastered areas. Here's how the first layer of ground cover looked in the area around the refinery tracks. While the basic scenery work was going on in Casper, I was also busy creating the backdrop. On a nice day in late June, I ran all over town taking pictures of Casper Mountain. Then I set about assembling them into the backdrop using Affinity Photo. By late July, I finished creating the backdrop, so I had it printed. It was ready to go. At the end of the month, I taped it in place to get a sense of how it would look. Late July saw a lot of different things going on. In addition to applying dirt in the yard and building the backdrop, I also installed fascia on the Casper benchwork. On the 5th of August, the Casper backdrop was permanently installed. Casper was really coming together. During the next week, I finished up the dirt in the engine terminal. During the middle of August, I ballasted all the tracks behind the engine terminal, including the Standard Oil track shown in this clip. The engine terminal itself is still to be done. Here's a shot of the loading racks taken in late August. While I was working on the various projects around Casper, I continued with construction of Rocky Mountain drilling. In early July, it looked like this. It wasn't installed on the layout yet. I just set it in place to get an idea of how it would look. By the end of July, I weathered the base and loading docks. I was only spending an hour or so here and there on the building, around other projects. I was making progress though. In late August, I spent a few days scratch building gooseneck light fixtures and installing them on the exterior. In early September, I almost moved Casper into final position in the corner, but then I remembered, I still needed to finish the scenery on the Chicago Northwestern line in the corner. I spent most of September finishing this area. Early in the month, I bought a big bag of polyfiber and painted it autumn brown. Then I started gluing it into place in the corner. Next came highlights on the top of the fiber. Finally, near the end of the month, basic scenery was complete in the area with the addition of weeds, grass, and other vegetation. Now I could move Casper into its final position. Once Casper was tucked into the corner, I replaced the casters with adjustable feet. After 15 months of construction, I could finally begin extending the main line out of Casper. I headed west, quickly constructing benchwork for Powder River and Showbone. I immediately followed up with new skyboard and foam sub-roadbed. As soon as the adhesive holding the foam to the benchwork was dry, I installed cork roadbed to Powder River and into the stock pen siding. By October 19th, I was laying track out of Casper towards Powder River. I had waited a long time to start this. Trains would finally have someplace to go. A couple days later, the main line had reached into Powder River. Now I needed more sub-roadbed to keep moving. At the west end of Powder River, I switched from foam sub-roadbed to plywood. I was at the end of the mostly flat terrain and approaching the hillier country that leads into the Wind River Canyon. By the end of October, I had the tracks laid into the stock pen siding and run a train there to test out the new track work. It wasn't far from Casper, but at least it was outside of Casper. In early November, I built the first section of benchwork for the Wind River Canyon / Thermopolis Peninsula and laid sub-roadbed and roadbed for Showbone and points west. The route that diverges to the right in the photo, the sub-roadbed without the roller sitting on it, is the Chicago and Northwestern line to Lander. The route with the roller on it is the Burlington line into Wind River Canyon. Once that first bit of sub-roadbed past Showbone was in, I spent several days completing the Canyon / Thermopolis benchwork. Showbone, by the way, is the turnout that sends the Chicago Northwestern and Burlington in different directions. By the middle of November, I was making good progress on the CNW line. This line will be hidden, sandwiched behind the canyon walls and the Thermopolis backdrop along the entire peninsula. Once I had the CNW tracks laid down to the free end of the peninsula, I switched over to construction of the Burlington line through the canyon. Then, of course, came the track into the canyon, followed a few days before Thanksgiving by a train. The day after Thanksgiving saw installation of the Burlington Turnback Curve sub-roadbed at the end of the peninsula. Through the end of the month, I caught up with wiring by installing bus lines and periodic feeders for both the CNW and the Burlington. I extended the CNW roadbed back down the peninsula to the wall in early December. Then I took about 10 days off from the layout, but by the middle of the month I was back at it, building the Riverton benchwork. At this point, I set myself the goal of completing the Chicago and Northwestern connection all the way from Casper to Hudson by the end of the year. On the 18th, I had nearly all the benchwork framing complete for the line, with only one small spot in Riverton to complete. That last spot was finished on the 23rd. The afternoon of the 23rd, I installed the plywood sub-roadbed for Riverton and brought the sub-roadbed from behind the canyon wall all the way up to Riverton. On Christmas Day, I began installing the cork sheets for Riverton. A couple days later, they were in and I had the track arrangement drawn on them. On the 28th, track reached from the canyon into the east end of Riverton. 3 days to go and about 15 feet of track left to install. On the 29th, track extended to the west end of Riverton, and on the 30th, it connected to the Chicago and Northwestern line over Casper. On the 31st, I installed temporary wiring to power the rails through Riverton, and the line was open. I met my goal. I put together a video celebrating the accomplishment and posted it to my YouTube channel. The link is in the description. So much for 2021. Work on the Canyon Peninsula trackage continued into January. I had the CNW line connected all the way through to Hudson, but a lot of that trackage is behind the walls of the Wind River Canyon, where it's 3 to 4 feet to the floor if something derails. I really don't want locos and cars dropping like dead weights to the hard floor below, so even though it will make getting to them a bit more difficult if I ever need to, I put up a 2-inch high fence all along the edges of the subroad bed. This fence was made from older styrene backdrops I knew I wouldn't use again. Materials cost me exactly nothing, well, except for the staples, that is. It took only a few hours to buy me peace of mind. The first week in January, I replaced the jury-rigged wiring I had for Riverton with the permanent connections. Then I turned my attention back to the Burlington line, laying in the subroad bed and road bed that leads into the town of Thermopolis. With the road bed now installed beyond the turnback curve, I was able to install the super elevation tape and lay the entire turnback curve. Up to this point, my throttle bus was simply wrapped around joists and stringers or laid across them whenever I extended the bus. I was using pre-made cables and simply coiled any excess length around convenient structure. It was time to change all that. I bought a couple 100-foot roll of 6-conductor flat cable and connectors from DigiKey. When they arrived, I drilled holes through the joist for throttle cables all throughout the layout. Left a bit of a mess on the floor, didn't it? Then I strung cable through all those holes, going from one throttle port to the next. As I reached each subsequent throttle port, I snipped the cable and installed a connector, leaving only a few inches of slack so the connector wouldn't be strained. No more big loops of excess cable. Now into the third week of January, I turned my attention to laying track into Thermopolis. First, of course, I needed subroad bed. I picked up a disturbingly expensive sheet of 1/2-inch plywood and cut it in half lengthwise. With a bit of trimming on the edge of one piece, this made the entire base for the town of Thermopolis. Over the next few days, I installed risers and secured the subroad bed to the benchwork. On the 23rd, I laid out the track arrangement for Thermopolis, then laid the mainline road bed through town. I spent the next several days gluing down the cork sheeting on the subroad bed, including ripping up one section that didn't stick well because I diluted the glue too much. After that happened, I just used full-strength yellow glue. By January 28th, the cork sheeting was all down and I laid track into the east end of Thermopolis proper. The next several days saw me installing all but the far west end of Thermopolis. I even labeled some wood blocks for the industries along the sidings. By February 6th, Thermopolis trackage was complete, including wiring. I was only missing 2 turnout ground throws at the far west end. On February 7th, I switched gears and began installing fascia at Riverton and around the engine facility in Casper. I'd been putting off the fascia at the engine terminal because I thought following that curve in the benchwork would be a real pain in the butt to do. To my surprise, it was pretty easy. By the 13th, I extended the Casper fascia out to Powder River and painted the Riverton fascia. On February 15th, I completed track work in Riverton. The main line through town had been done in late December, and now it was time to install the siding and industrial spur. By the 17th, I painted all the main level fascia, and I even mounted the turntable controls into it. Next, I installed the Riverton and Showbond skyboards. This completed skyboard installation for this end of the layout, The mountains of the Wind River Canyon will cover the ends. At this point, I began preparations for what I'd been waiting over 20 years for: operations on my layout. I added labels for all industry spots completed so far at all locations. This even included industries that were partially built in Casper. I was all set to go, then Kurt, the friend who's helped me with some aspects of layout construction and who was going to help me test the layout in this initial operating session, called to report he was ill. We would have to postpone. I was a bit disappointed for sure, but it wasn't like the session would never happen. So I soldiered on, beginning construction of the Douglas benchwork east of Casper. By March 2nd, the Douglas benchwork was installed on the walls below Hudson. Finally, the big day arrived. No more delays. On March 3rd, Kurt and I conducted the inaugural operating session of the layout. Because track work was completed only for a few towns, this session was very limited. There were only the two of us. Kurt took the local to Thermopolis to switch the industries there, while I switched the Casper yard and industries. Kurt has a mostly complete layout, one of the largest in Casper, on which he occasionally hosts operating sessions of 5 or more operators. I was eager and somewhat apprehensive to hear his assessment of my layout. It was good. He said the trains ran well and he had a good time. Success! March became loco maintenance month. Every couple of days I would pull a loco off the track to do either just preventive maintenance or both PM and repairs as needed. I started easy with PM to the 060 and 080 switchers. Then came work on the Mikados. One required only preventive maintenance, lubrication, and installation of an upgraded decoder chip. The second Mikado required a simple adjustment in the trailing truck area in addition to the PM. The third Mikado required major surgery. After researching potential repairs to the faulty left-hand valve gear, I took the coward's way out and replaced the entire mechanism with an almost new one I had on hand. I've still got the old mechanism and will address it at my leisure sometime in the future. Maybe. While I was working on locos every few days, I also did other things around the layout. After sitting on top of the ground for months, I finally embedded Rocky Mountain drilling into the dirt. This area and the building itself are still not finished, but it sure looks better than it did. In the middle of March, I installed and painted the Douglas skyboard. That same day, I started on the scenery base in the curve between Powder River and Showbone. I wanted to have some low hills right behind the track in this area, so I stopped with the foam almost immediately. It would be a lot easier to install the backdrop if I didn't have to tuck it in behind the hills. There was one other thing to do before I could do the thing I had to do before I could build the 3D scenery: paint the track. I spent a few days installing missing ties at all the rail joints, my least favorite thing to do on the layout. Then I taped wax paper over all the skyboards to protect against overspray and painted the track. I started at Powder River, worked my way through the Showbone switch, and painted the Burlington track all the way to the east end of Thermopolis. I didn't paint Thermopolis, but I did paint all the newly installed Chicago and Northwestern track on the upper level. Now I could install the backdrop from the west end of Casper all the way to the canyon. This was completed on March 31st. With the backdrop installed all the way to the canyon, I got back to work on the 3D scenery west of Powder River. Not only did I put in the base foam for Powder River to Showbone, but I also began messing around with foam for the base in the south end of the canyon itself. None of this was glued down yet. I was just trying to get a sense of how to proceed. One of the first things I figured out was that I needed a solid base on the benchwork for the foam if it was to be at all stable. I had quite a bit of 3/4 inch oak veneer plywood left over from the library bookcase project, mostly 6 inches wide by 4 feet long cut-off ends of the plywood sheets. They work great as a base for the canyon walls. Certainly they were strong enough to provide a stable base, so I trimmed them to fit the area and attached them solidly to the benchwork. The first pieces of foam went down permanently on April 12th. I didn't really have much of an idea of what I was doing, but I figured the best way to learn was to just do it. For the first few layers in this area, I used DAP Alex Plus latex caulk to glue the foam pieces together. This worked, but I could only do a couple of layers before having to pause a few hours to let the caulk start to set. This was going to take forever. After 3 days, this was all I had done. I needed to find a faster setting adhesive if I wanted to finish the canyon before I die of old age. I dug out my low temperature hot glue gun and gave it a shot. Within about an hour, I doubled what had taken 3 days to do with the caulk. By the 19th, I was building tunnel number 5, the southernmost tunnel in the canyon. I was learning how easy it was to cut the foam with a serrated knife, but boy, did it leave a mess on the floor. The very next day, I had the tunnel completely framed and even set a portal I'd scratch built decades earlier into the north portal mouth. Then I ran a train through the tunnel to make sure it was clear. After that, it was just a matter of cutting and stacking foam. By the 24th, I had the very south end of the canyon stacked to its finished height. I figured it was time to overlay some plaster cloth onto the pink foam. I started with Powder River on the 27th. I did just a small section and stopped for the day to let the cloth harden. If this didn't work, I didn't want to have to tear out too big a section. The next day the plaster cloth was hardened. It appears to have worked okay, so I set up a workstation for cutting and applying the cloth and went to town. I laid cloth right around the corner to Showbon and then on into the canyon itself. As I surveyed my work at the end of the day, I thought it wasn't bad. At this point, I left the canyon for a few days to continue work on a way car project I was in the middle of, and to build the narrow bit of benchwork that would reach from the west end of Thermopolis to the east end of Worland. I jumped over to the Douglas benchwork and ran the throttle bus all the way to the end. This gave me a spot to plug in throttles right at the workbench, a big help when working on powered rolling stock and locomotives. In early May, I hopped back over to the canyon to apply a second layer of plaster cloth at the south end. This increased the strength and stability of the scenery tremendously. Unfortunately, I was now also out of plaster cloth. On May 6th and 7th, I constructed the first section of the Worland/Grable Peninsula. For this piece, I was able to recycle, with some modification, one of the last 3 remaining grids from the New Jersey layout. Then it was back to the canyon again. I started stacking more of the canyon wall, working my way north. On the 8th, I had this. Work progressed over the next few days until the canyon looked like this on the 13th. Foam stacking in the canyon continued even further, but I changed my approach somewhat and began using an open cribbing style. On May 20th, I used my hot wire tool to carve off the corners of the foam stacks north of Tunnel 5. Then I went to town with a Sureform tool, roughing up the vertical surfaces so the plaster cloth would have something to grab hold of. I thought cutting the foam with a kitchen knife was messy. It was nothing compared to the piles of little foam beads the Sureform tool left all over. I hadn't tested clearances on the C&W track, the one behind the canyon wall, since I'd started stacking the canyon. I decided it was past time I did so. On May 22nd, I cleaned all the foam chunks off the track and ran a train all the way up and all the way down the C&W line. I found one or two spots that needed a small amount of trimming, but once done, the test train ran fine without any incidents over the entire line. By the 23rd of May, I had more plaster cloth on hand, so I was ready to start plastering the foam walls once more. A couple days later, I was out of cloth again, but the canyon wall was now plastered past the north end of tunnel number 4. That was the end of plastering for a while. Since work on the canyon had come to a standstill again, the last couple of days of May, I turned my attention to extending the Burlington subroad bed out of Thermopolis and into the east end of Worland. Over the next few days in June, I laid the track and installed the power bus and feeders on this new stretch. Finally, on June 6th, the 50-pound bag of hydrocal I'd ordered over a month earlier showed up. I never worked with hydrocal before, so I was once again entering unknown territory. I mixed up my first batch, tinting it with brown powdered tempera pigment. I painted this first batch onto the canyon wall and waited overnight for it to set. The next day I saw that the tinted hydrocal had set up properly, so I proceeded on with applying it over more of the plaster cloth. 2 days later, I decided it was time to try my hand at making some rocks at the south end of Tunnel 5. I crinkled up some heavy-duty aluminum foil, shaped it into a rectangle with sides all around, and poured in some hydrocal that was tinted with black tempera. After letting it begin to set up, I stuck it to the wall at the south portal. After about 15 minutes, I peeled away the aluminum foil. This was going a lot better than I had any right to expect. That actually looked something like a rock wall. I added one more rock wall inside the tunnel mouth and called it a day. After looking at the south portal for a couple of days, I decided the road above the wall, which is supposed to continue right over the portal, just didn't look right. I marked the rock where I wanted to cut it and got busy with a utility knife. Hydrocal is hard. It took me half an hour to cut through the rock wall and part of the canyon wall above, but when I finished, it looked like this. A couple days later, the rock wall with the reworked area looked like this. Over the next 3 days, I continued painting brown hydrocal over the plaster cloth, plus added a few more rock castings at the south end. This is how the canyon looks now. And there we have it. The second year of existence of the CB&Q in Wyoming, version 5, is in the books. We went from this on June 25th of 2021 to this on June 25th, 2022. What you've seen was everything major on the layout. There were other things, of course, like the acquisition of additional motive power and passenger cars, plus the construction of more than a dozen freight cars and a couple of Chicago and Northwestern Way cars, complete with DCC-controlled marker lights. Thanks for joining me on this review of the second year of the layout. I hope you enjoyed it. Now it's back to the usual monthly updates, plus the occasional operations episode, and maybe a few others from time to time as well. Thanks for watching. Stay safe and happy model railroading. See you soon.